Hi, my name is Frank Uhle. I'm one of the projectionists at the Ann Arbor Film Festival. I recently wrote a book called Cinema Ann Arbor from University of Michigan Press and Fifth Avenue Press that is a history of the underground film scene in Ann Arbor. And one of the major parts of that is the Ann Arbor Film Festival. And we are sitting here in what's now called Lorch Hall in what was once the Architecture and Art School. This was originally called the Architecture Auditorium. And this is where the Ann Arbor Film Festival began in 1963. An art school professor named George Manupelli was an experimental filmmaker, and he decided that he wanted to have a forum for his work that was more than just like spotty screenings here and there. And he'd actually been a part of something called the Once Group, which was a experimental music organization, and they had Robert Ashley and George Cacioppo and some other amazing experimental composers putting on concerts every year for a couple of years, and he decided to try an experimental film festival as an offshoot of that. So the first Ann Arbor Film Festival happened in this room in 1963, and it continued on in this space for about the next 17 years. So when the film festival started, they needed to have some infrastructure to sell tickets and to advertise it and to help have ushers and things. And they were very fortunate because Ann Arbor had, at that time, a film society run by students called Cinema Guild. And Cinema Guild was officially part of the student legislature, but in the 50s, it had started in, actually it dated to the early 30s as under a different name, but in the late 50s it started getting a little bit more experimental, a little bit more freaky, and not just showing kind of mainstream movies for the student body to use as cheap entertainment. And so when George Manupelli approached Cinema Guild, they were very happy to help him co-sponsor the film festival. So his film festival was always co-sponsored by Cinema Guild, and it was called the Dramatic Arts Center, which was another local experimental theater and music organization that had been involved with the Once Group. So Ann Arbor always had kind of an interesting position. It was kind of an hour away from Detroit, and the cultural offerings in Detroit were just a little further for some people that wanted to see like the new art films and things. So in the early 30s, actually in the late 20s, some very pioneering people started showing films in campus auditoriums to allow people on campus and the community here to see the latest like foreign film releases and things. So Ann Arbor actually might have had the very first student film society in the country, started in 1932, the Art Cinema League. And what happened was we just kind of built up this culture here of people showing, you know, the latest foreign releases that were only maybe seen in big cities. And also, they started building in some experimental film, some repertory cinema. So by the late 50s, it had really started humming, and they were showings 4 nights a week here in this auditorium for Cinema Guild. And one of the key members of Cinema Guild was a man named Ed Weber, who was a gay man who was a very left-wing kind of oriented libertarian guy. He was actually, some would say he was an anarchist, and he became the archivist of the Labadie collection of social protest materials, and he was always pushing to show experimental films and things that were cutting edge. So by the late 50s, he would slip in a new Stan Brakhage film in front of like, you know, The Wizard of Oz or something. And people actually wrote protest letters that came to see these movies and were shocked by seeing something that was, you know, sexually advanced for the time. And by the early 60s, when the Ann Arbor Film Festival started here, Ann Arbor had kind of built up this expectation of seeing the latest kind of cutting edge films, and the Ann Arbor Film Festival brought the latest cutting edge films. I mean, so the Ann Arbor Film Festival, being run by a filmmaker, George Manupelli, kind of built this trust that the filmmakers really seized on, and even within a couple of years, it was a hotspot for experimental film, and all the big names would submit their films to be possibly win prizes and to be exhibited, because we also had a huge audience here. We had, by the second or third year, almost all the shows would sell out. They were just massively supported by the local community. So the Ann Arbor Film Festival came at the right time when the experimental film underground was just kind of bursting into full flower, but also Ann Arbor was the right place for it. It might have played in New York and LA and San Francisco and a few other big cities, but there wouldn't necessarily even be as many people. Ann Arbor just, I don't know, we just loved experimental film here. So I wrote this book called Cinema Ann Arbor, and I initially envisioned it as kind of a magazine article about the campus film societies and how they, showed like subtitled movies for college students for 50 years or something. And I started going around and interviewing people that I knew that had been involved, and I had been a part of it. I had been a member of Cinema too. But it turned out that every person I interviewed had some stories that I'd never heard before, and some of them were, to me, kind of shocking. There were things about the Gay Liberation Front getting on stage and stopping a screening of the movie The Boys in the Band because they felt the stereotypes were demeaning. There was a whole series of protests for the film The Birth of a Nation, which was playing here starting in about 1950. And in fact, when it played here in 1950, the speech departments programmed it, and so many people protested it that the screening was shut down. And it would continue to be protested thereafter, even as it became part of the campus film curriculum. But the book just started expanding, and I covered the birth of the University of Michigan Film Program, which the film societies built up. They paid for the screenings for, they helped supply staffing for, and then the filmmaking that was happening here. There was a lot of experimental filmmaking inspired by the Ann Arbor Film Festival by a lot of the members of the Film Society. So people like Jay Cassidy, Andrew Lugg, Elliot Barden, Ellen Frank, a bunch of others were actually members of Cinema Guild, and they started making experimental films. In fact, right in this building, George Manupelli started teaching a class that wasn't accredited. He approached the art school faculty or administration, and they said, we're not offering this. The university wasn't considering film a serious topic at all. And Manupelli said, okay, well, give me a space and I'll teach an after-hours class. He actually did it on his own. And people like Pat Olesko, the great performance artist who appears here and has for the last 60 years, started taking that class and started making films on her own. And she became an amazing filmmaker. And so Manupelli kind of was helping with filmmaking, so there was a lot of that going on. There was a film festival. There was an 8mm film festival that started. So my book expanded and expanded to include all these topics, and it became a book. It wasn't just a magazine article. But a lot of what I really liked about the book was I interviewed about 80 people. With so many people that came through here were just energized by this. I interviewed Ken Burns, who remembered vividly coming to the film festival when he was in high school. He kind of snuck in, but it was just like blowing my mind watching these movies. And people like Lawrence Kasdan was a member of Cinema Guild. An old housemate of mine, John Sloss, is now the producer of Richard Linklater's films and Errol Morris's films, Todd Haynes' films. Many, many other people that came through the film societies went on to somewhere in the world of film, and a lot of them were inspired before the film school even had existed. They were just learning about film by going, there were so many films of so many different varieties, they were able to just immerse themselves in film, and frankly, a lot of them never did take a film class. They just became film nuts and learned by doing, and it was kind of an amazing culture here because this all happened before streaming, before video stores, before any kind of access to films other than watching it projected on a screen. So the first couple of years of the film festival were slowly building up. The first year they didn't even have a jury. They just didn't give prizes. They got a lot of films from the Chicago Film Festival that was happening, and a few films from the the National Film Board of Canada. So that was 1963. 1964, they actually had a jury. So then a Cinema Guild member, Hugh Cohen, was one of the judges, and they got Pauline Kael, who was then just kind of starting out as a film critic. She wasn't working for the New Yorker where she became famous. But she flew in to be a judge, and a couple other people, and that was the second year, so they gave out some prizes. The third year, in 1965, they were going to get Jonas Mekas, who was then the kind of experimental film leading light in the country with his New York Cinematheque that he was showing films at and writing for the Village Voice. He couldn't make it. This guy Gregory Markopoulos came in. There was a lot of controversy. He got mad. He left town, trashed the film festival. That was 65. 66, it had gotten to the point where Jordan Manupelli could call up Andy Warhol and say, we want you to come out and show your films and do whatever else. And the Velvet Underground had just, at that point, barely existed. They had performed a few times in New York and I think a couple other places on the East Coast, but they hadn't recorded anything. They weren't a known entity. They were just part of Andy Warhol's like traveling factory freak show. So they agreed to come out here, I think for $350. They all rented an RV and they drove, I think there were 11 of them, drove way across the country where most of them had never been out this far. Crashed a few blocks from here at Joe Ware's house of the Once Group and his wife Ann Ware, and performed here on Saturday night, March 12, 1966, at the film festival. And I think they first showed a couple of Andy Warhol's films, and then the Underground came out and they set up on the stage here, which I'm sitting right in front of the stage. Maureen Tucker had like a big drum, and I don't even know if she had cymbals, sitting in a little portable classroom chair, a couple microphones, Lou Reed, Nico, John Cale switched between the bass and the viola, and then Sterling Morrison. And they somehow got their amps on this little tiny stage, and the screen was down, and they were showing movies on the screen. So Andy Warhol was up in the projection booth, and he was, I think there were 2 projectors up there, if I'm not mistaken, running lights, running film on the screen. There was a person over here with a portable projector on a cart. There was a person midway down this aisle, which there used to be in the center aisle here, showing films on the screen and on the band. And Warhol had like a big flashing light, and he was bouncing like a big silver balloon around the room. And apparently it was deafening. People in those days weren't used to loud live music. And the reviews were that it was deafening, but people were just blown away by it. They did 2 performances. One of the cool things about the film festival, as it grew, in the late 60s, George Magnapelli decided, apparently he was a somewhat difficult guy at times, but he was a visionary, and he decided to have a tour of the films that had been, most appreciated at the festival. So he hooked up with these colleges and art film theaters around the country, several dozen of them by the late 60s, and would ship, a big trunk full of approximately 12 hours of films that had played the festival, which was roughly 36 hours. So they would take about a third of the films, put them in this big trunk, ship them, go from college to college to college. They'd pay $1 a minute for each screening to the filmmakers, and the filmmakers loved it. They could get their work shown all over, they get more money. Some of these places would award prizes as part of another little mini festival. So Magnapelli was getting all the Ann Arbor Film Festival's attention all around the country. And that naturally led to more filmmakers submitting their work, and people would come in from out of town. So the Museum of Modern Art would send a scout to watch the film festival, starting in the late 60s, to decide to buy prints for their collection or to screen there. So sitting here in this auditorium, there's so many historical things that happened here. And one of the more memorable things that was covered in my book, and has been covered, of course, elsewhere, was the infamous arrest of 4 members of Cinema Guild in January of 1967 for screening the film Flaming Creatures. This was a film made by Jack Smith in New York. He had, I think it was made in 1963. It had already caused several arrests. Jonas Mekas, in fact, was arrested and convicted of obscenity in New York and sentenced to, I think, a suspended sentence of 30 or 60 days and paid a fine. But the Cinema Guild members, and Ed Weber, who was this radical, underground kind of cinema-loving guy who was very straight-laced. He always wore a suit, very clean-cut looking guy, had white hair. He was kind of a, shy, kind of graduate student-y guy, but that wasn't where he was coming from in real life. He was crazy. But he said, let's show Flaming Creatures. Again, a couple years after people had been arrested for it. And the Cinema Guild board were like, okay. And they put it on the schedule. And at the time, Ann Arbor was a very conservative place, and there was no campus police force. The campus was patrolled by the Ann Arbor police. They would walk through buildings, I guess. If there was a disturbance, Ann Arbor police would show up with guns on their hips. It was kind of crazy. But they had this one particular officer named Lieutenant Eugene Stoudemire, who was charged with, I guess, morality crimes. He was kind of not wearing a police uniform, he's wearing a suit, but there's lots of stories about him going, and people would go to Toledo and buy cigarettes and not pay the Michigan tax and drive up in the trunk of their car, and he would bust them and throw the cigarettes in the trash or pour unlicensed beer down the drain. But so he heard about Cinema Guild showing Flaming Creatures, all the bad trouble, and they called Cinema Guild and said, well, we're going to come and arrest you if you show it. And my friend Hugh Cohen, professor who's still teaching film here, as a matter of fact, at 93, said, well, we're going to show it anyway. And the U of M administrators came and tried to talk them out of it, and they still persisted. So they started the film in this auditorium, full house. All the students had heard, oh, there's going to be some dirty film. And they had a sellout. And sure enough, about 5 or 6 minutes in, there's some full frontal nudity, tame by today's standards. And Lieutenant Sotomayor went up to the projection booth and insisted that the film be stopped, and he confiscated it. Had the projectionist take it out of the projector, hand it to him. Hugh Cohen ran up, said, give me a receipt, which he actually still kept in his records. It's just an illustration in my book. And so this trial, the police, a couple days later, arrested 4 students, including Hugh, who was officially the faculty advisor of Cinema Guild, and 3 20-year-old students. And they had this year-long kind of back and forth with courts and lots of lawyers and stopping and starting the trial. And Cinema Guild ended up getting Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground to come out a second time and play at Hill Auditorium, which was, in fact, a debacle because so many people came to see it that were expecting, I guess, maybe something really racy, and it was more like the mainstream students, not the hipsters that came to the film festival. So this is the film festival projection booth from the original Ann Arbor Film Festival, and it's actually been expanded. In its day, it was about 2/3 the size that it is now. It was tiny. It was very cramped, and we had, at the time during the film festival, in circa '63 to the early '70s, we just had 16 millimeter. We added 35 millimeter in the mid '70s, and so there were actually 4 projectors crammed into a space that's, you can imagine, being a little bit smaller. Now, currently we only have 35 millimeter, but these lamp houses were actually purchased by the original film festival. This space is where Andy Warhol sat during the Velvet Underground performance. He was probably right about here, and there were at the time 2 60 millimeter projectors with carbon arc lamps. I'm not sure if Peter Wilde was in the booth that day or not. He had just started as a member of Cinema Guild. He may not have been in the booth. They had several people involved, and they had a union projectionist guy named Ralph Waldo who was involved in the film festival screenings too. But Andy Warhol was sitting here, and the Velvet Underground were playing down there, and the projected films were on the screen, and it was just, a Warhol happening. And apparently Warhol would reach up periodically with a piece of paper, flip it in front of the lens just to make the film cut in and out, and manipulate it that way. And again, the Velvet Underground were playing. There were 2 other projectors in the front of the room. There was a big light on the side of the screen that was flashing at the audience. It was a sensory overload experience. I'd love for you to come to the Ann Arbor Film Festival. It's a great event, and it's been going for 62 years.